getting me this. Is this working?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Because if I stood behind here, like the good original lady from Australia did yesterday, you wouldn't see me. So. Okay. I have a reference guide in the football bags that you might get out to just follow along with. Is this okay?
I'll turn it up for you then.
Oh, turn it up. Do I have it on correctly?
Looks like this.
Yeah.
Try again.
Okay, testing. Yeah, I think I'm getting.
Just give you a little bit more space.
Yeah, be comfortable. I'm sorry. I might.
That's right.
For ease of communication, I'm going to refer to our association as ISEE throughout this presentation, so that I don't have to spell out each word, or I might often say our association, and you'll know what I'm talking about. I was 43 when a small group of educators, idealistic educators, meeting in Israel in 1979, elected me the first president of ISEE. Kurt Lewin, the most
I'm sorry. Hold on for a second. I'm trying to bring the volume up. I think that's the best we can do.
Okay. Thank you. Kurt Lewin, the most outstanding of American social psychologists, was 43 when he moved from Nazi Germany to America instead of Palestine in 1933 to accept a special 2-year refugee appointment as a social psychologist in home economics at Cornell University. Today I present my third keynote address at an ISEE convention. I gave my first to start the 1979 meeting, my second at our 8th convention held in my home state of Oregon in 1994. ISEE was then having its 15th birthday, half as old as it is today. And I reflected on our coming into adolescence and how far we had grown as an international force in education. In that address, I mentioned perhaps 100 names of ISEE members who had made significant contributions to the study of cooperation and education. In particular, I especially praised the seminal contributions of Elizabeth Cohen, who died on March 13, 2005. After more than 20 years of outstanding work for ISEE, Liz brought a sociologist's point of view to cooperative learning, was particularly concerned with overcoming the negative consequences for students who had been assigned inferior status by their peers in the classroom, and was generous in her contributions of time, knowledge, and expertise to our association. She most certainly would have deserved this award that I am receiving today. Just before her untimely death, Yael Sharon wrote effectively in our association's newsletter about the first 25 years of ISEE's history. And Celeste talked about it yesterday, so I will not say much about those years today. Let me go back, however, for a moment to our founding in 1979. 12 people volunteered to serve on the initial executive committee. Shlomo Sharon, then our inspirational leader, became secretary and editor of our first newsletter. Clark Webb of Brigham Young University became our treasurer and helped us organize our second convention 3 years later. At least one of the original 12 was to have been here today. I guess he became ill, was unable to travel. He is Neil Davidson, one of our most outstanding researchers and members and tireless contributors to ISEE. Others here today who took part in that initial extraordinary convention are Spencer Kagan and Yael Sharon. Unfortunately, Pat was not at that first meeting, but
I was taking care of kids.
she was taking care of kids. You know them well because we all love them and cherish their contributions. On this, the occasion of our association's first Lifetime Achievement Award, I believe it's appropriate, partly due to my age and experience, to discuss the prehistory of ISEE, the archaeological history of ISEE. In particular, I shall focus on the three most important Lewinians: Kurt Lewin, Morton Deutsch, and Ronald Lippert. I shall explain how they helped shape our shared ways of thinking about the study of cooperation in education for the past 31 years, even as we meet here in Brisbane for what I think is perhaps our 15th or so international conference. At the birth of ISEE in Israel, where Kurt Lewin at age 43 might have gone to take up residence at the Hebrew University, and on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea in Herzliya, we, the founders, set out to build on John Dewey's philosophical ideas about democratic education and Kurt Lewin's creative research methods to study democratic leadership and cooperative learning. ISEE, as you know, was to become an international network of educators with a common interest in studying cooperation in education. We did not know at the time how long it might exist. The word study, meaning the pursuit of knowledge by interviewing and observing and asking people through questionnaires, was brought forth by Dr. Harriet Talmadge, then professor of education at the University of Illinois at Chicago Circle, and decided by consensus of the executive committee to include a broader array of knowledge production activities than the word research might typically conjure up. We wanted, of course, to include traditional quantitative and qualitative methods, but more than that, we sought to include educators' attentive scrutiny, their professional reflections, practitioner case studies, teacher informational exchanges, and of course, Lewin's action research. At that first historic meeting, we deliberately chose the word education, writ large, to include all social system levels of schooling, which Celeste referred to yesterday as a very important aspect of student achievement. Thus, along with all of the varieties of classroom-based cooperative learning, which we're witnessing here at this meeting, we wished also to include topics like organizational development of schools, the cooperative faculty, cooperative school community relations, cooperative higher ed faculties, cooperative school boards, etc. Indeed, my keynote address at that meeting to open that founding conference focused on using organization development strategies and problem-solving skills to engage students in school-wide governance and to motivate teachers and administrators to work cooperatively with students to establish healthy climates. Now allow me to carry us back in time 43 years before the birth of ISEE to the year I was born 1936. You can calculate my age. The troubled Western world was in economic and political turmoil. More than 25% of the hungry American workforce was without jobs. And Hitler's militaristic, anti-Semitic authoritarianism was on the rise and becoming ever more threatening to international peace. Lewin, who we might think of as our association's great-grandfather, having completed his temporary bridge appointment at Cornell, was finishing his first year in the Iowa Child Welfare Research Station at the University of Iowa. A few fascinating facts about Lewin, his early years, might be of interest to you. He was born on the 9th day of the 9th month of the 90th year of the 19th century. September 9th, 1890. He himself described this as, quote, the 9th nine of 90. He grew up in rural Mogilno, Prussia, which is now part of Poland, where 6 years ago Larry Sherman, a longtime board member of ISE and treasurer of ISE, Pat, and I attended an international conference to celebrate Lewin's contributions to social psychology. The conference organizers designed a ceremony in front of the building in which young Kurt resided when he attended elementary school. A few of us noticed that the memorial plaque on the wall read, Kurt Lewin, born on 9/9/1990. It was fully engraved already, and there on the building. I thought to myself, the engraver must have been drunk on nines. Kurt's Minneapolis-based nephew named Tom Lewin, the only family member who was present at the ceremony, whispered in my ear, Dick, see when Kurt came into the world? I nodded, yes. Tom said, we always knew he was ahead of his time. In 1890, Mogilno, Kurt's family name was pronounced Levin. When he left Mogilno to attend secondary school in Berlin in 1905 at age 15, his name was pronounced Levine. When in 1936 his European-born daughter Miriam went off to elementary school for the first time in Iowa City, her teachers addressed her as Miriam Lewin. From then on, Kurt's American family name became Lewin. And his many American doctoral students from 1936 to the year of his death in 1947 and well beyond were called Lewinians. Thus, for example, you might refer to David W. Johnson, a well-known expert in cooperative learning, and me as Lewinians. Later in this address, I shall explain that a bit further. But of course, I was not a Lewinian from 1936 to 1947. I was a mere boy, second-born, growing up in Chicago, learning to read, write, and compute, and to love baseball. The quintessential American model for cooperation and competition. Again, let us go back to 1936. Ron Lippitt, now the most famous of Lewinian action researchers, who became my mentor at the University of Michigan in 1959, that was 20 years before the start of ISE, was offered an assistantship at the University of Iowa in the late spring of 1936. I know that during the first 2 weeks of June, he rushed to get on a Greyhound bus, taking him to Chicago, where he would have been transferred into a bus bound for Iowa. I like to imagine that his transfer took place in downtown Chicago, close to the Cook County Hospital where I was being born, June 13, 1936. And while I, all 6 pounds of me, was facing the challenge of survival at that downtown Chicago hospital, my mentor-to-be, all 22 youthful years of him, was facing the challenge of switching buses and moving toward the Iowa cornfields, perhaps for him, the field of dreams, to take on an undefined graduate student assistantship. Years later, Lippitt told Lewin's biographer, Alfred Morrow, "When I went to Iowa as a graduate student, I was not aware of Kurt Lewin and did not go to Iowa in order to study with him. Ironically, for me, years later, I could myself make a parallel statement. For when I went to Michigan as a doctoral student in 1959, I was unaware of Ron Lippitt and did not decide to study social psychology at Michigan in order to do research with him." Lippitt went on to tell Morrow, "When I finally arrived in Iowa City after a long bus ride, I was assigned by the administration to assist 2 of Lewin's assistants, Roger Barker and Tamara Dembo, to code the observational data of a major laboratory experiment with children to test the Freudian hypothesis that children who are frustrated will demonstrate regressive behavior, the so-called frustration regression experiments. And that's how I started with Kurt," said Ron. Notice all of these people will talk to each other always in their first names, not in formal professor, Herr Doctor, and so forth. During the next very productive 11 years, Kurt and Ron collaborated on both social experiments and action research projects. During the 4 years that Lippitt was Lewin's graduate student, they focused on the study of children, and they carried out the famous democratic, authoritarian, and laissez-faire leadership field experiments. During the 5 years of the war, they did action research together focused on soldiers to improve social behaviors of soldiers in military situations. They then collaborated in action research after the war on intergroup relations to reduce ethnic prejudice in Connecticut at the brand new Research Center for Group Dynamics in the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, from the end of the war in 1945 until Lewin's all too early death in 1947. It was at MIT on the shores of the Charles River where the Lewinian Foundation for ISE would start to take on a more complete shape, some 31 years before we, the founders, voted on the definitions of study and education in Israel. One of the first graduate students to arrive at the new Research Center for Group Dynamics in 1945 was the 25-year-old Morton Deutsch, who was interested both in social and clinical psychology. Born in 1920, Deutsch has had a career that now in 2010 spans the history of modern American social psychology. During the fall of 1946, after studying social psychology for 1 year with Lewin, Lippitt, Festinger, and Cartwright, Deutsch approached Lewin about doing a dissertation to compare cooperation and competition in small groups. He met several times that fall privately with Lewin about his ideas, and then in January of 1947, Deutsch, at one of the then famous Tuesday MIT seminars that were called from the German Quasselstrippes, meaning to ramble on and to talk freely, he spoke a good deal about his thoughts for an experimental study of the effects of cooperation and competition upon group processes. Lewin scheduled Deutsch's meeting for the formal defense of his dissertation for Thursday, February 13th, 1947. Deutsch would be the first Lewinian to do a field experiment on cooperation and competition. On Tuesday evening, February 11th, Lewin became ill. His wife Gertrude called their family physician, who came to the Lewin home immediately. The physician determined that Kurt had had a heart attack and made plans to hospitalize him early the next morning. Soon after the doctor left, Lewin suffered a fatal seizure and died. On the next day, a small funeral service was held in the Lewin home on a national holiday, Abraham Lincoln's birthday. Also happens to be the day Pat and my first daughter was born many, many years later, February 12th. And in these days, it was a very large holiday in the United States. Now we have a single day called President's Day, which sort of includes Lincoln, Washington, and everybody else. On February 13th, that's the day after the funeral, Ron Lippert stepped up to take Lewin's place as chair of Morton Deutsch's oral defense of his dissertation proposal. Lippert was only 5.5 years older than Deutsch. At that moment, Lippert and the committee, accepted and signed off on Deutsch's study, IZ was in gestation. A developmental legacy that would take 32 years to reach fruition. After that poignant collaboration between Deutsch and Lippert, Kurt's legacy divided into two distinct but overlapping intellectual paths. One, the longer path, dating back to his European years, entailed his innovative studies on field theory and the life space, and his creative social experiments. On the first path, the principal research activities focused on building logical theory, testing hypotheses, and establishing scientific laws. The second, shorter, much less traveled action research path, had commenced at Iowa City only a few years before Kurt's death, and entailing applying social theory and research designs for planned change and societal improvement. Regardless of the path his students would embrace, however, all believed in Lewin's fundamental theorem that the groups in which individuals live constitute the basic ground for their perceptions, feelings, and behaviors. Excuse me. Lewinians traveling the first path were theory-oriented experimental social psychologists such as Morton Deutsch. They produce a large repository of scientific research on group dynamics with imaginative theories, creative hypotheses, and careful laboratory research. In their journal articles, they demonstrated that what Kurt wrote in 1939 was true. In quote, "I am persuaded," he wrote, "that it is possible to undertake experiments in sociology which have as much right to be called scientific experiments as those in physics and chemistry." No single research project exemplified Lewin's statement more clearly than Mort Deutsch's 1948 dissertation, entitled The Effects of Cooperation and Competition upon Group Process. His experimental research to compare cooperation with competition was so outstanding that the editors of the new international journal from England called Human Relations gave enormous space in 1949 for 2 back-to-back articles amounting to a total of 55 pages at a frugal time when most social psychological experiments earned less than 10 pages. And we are talking about a 28-year-old scholar.
Let me adjust that. It's slipping on you.
It's getting down to my eyes. I won't be able to see it. I'm unaccustomed to these
Let's
technologies.
do it a little different.
All right. Thank you, sir.
This behind you. Put it back here.
Oh,
How's that?
oh, that's nice. Thank you. Very, very kind. In his introduction, Deutsch wrote, "There has been little in the way of explicit theory and virtually no experimental work with respect to the effects of cooperation and competition upon social processes. The purpose of this research is to develop a theory of the effects of cooperation and competition upon small face-to-face group functioning and to present the results of an experimental study of such effects." In the project, Deutsch developed 34 hypotheses, which he tested with 50 volunteer college students in an introductory psychology course offered by the Industrial Relations section of MIT. His experimental procedures called for undergraduate students who were randomly assigned to small groups of 5 to work together on human relations problems under conditions of either cooperation or competition. While working together, the experimental subjects were observed by trained observers, and later the subjects filled out several questionnaires. Deutsch and 4 assistants carefully coded and analyzed the data and applied appropriate statistical procedures to test his hypotheses. More than half of the 55 journal pages were given over to the analyses of these experimental results. Deutsch concluded the following about the experimental results. Greater group productivity may be expected when the members are cooperative rather than competitive in their relationships. The communication of ideas, coordination of efforts, friendliness, and pride in one's group, which are basic to group harmony and effectiveness, tend to be disrupted when members see themselves to be competing for mutually exclusive goals. There is evidence further that competitiveness produces greater personal insecurity through expectations of hostility from others than does cooperation. One may well question whether a competitive grading system produces the kinds of interrelationships among students, the task directedness and personal security that are in keeping with sound educational objectives. In the 1960s, Mort Deutsch accepted a professorship at Teachers College, Columbia University, New York City. From 1964 to 1966, he served as David Johnson's mentor. David Johnson now has 500 plus articles, 50 books. It goes on and on for David and Roger. They are perhaps the most prolific, along with Spencer, of our writers in cooperation in education. David participated from 82 or so, I think, the Salt Lake meeting, maybe the Provo, Utah meeting, till about 1994 or so, off and on in our development as an association. Through David's enormous contributions to the study of cooperation in education, ISE has a direct historic link to Lewinians traveling the first path. Lewinians who traveled along the second path were applied social psychologists such as Ron Lippitt. Although Kurt published at least 10 articles on the topic of education, he published only one, unfortunately, about action research as a strategy for planned change. That article of only 15 pages was printed in 1946 in the Journal of Social Issues, a journal of one of the divisions of the American Psychological Association. It was published a few months before he died. A year later, Gertrude Weiss Lewin, Kurt's spouse, published her husband's applied papers in an edited collection entitled Resolving Social Conflicts, bringing his creative ideas about action research into public view and eventually into public consciousness. No one of Lewin's outstanding students was more central to the development of action research than Ronald Lippitt, co-author of a book called The Dynamics of Planned Change. Lippitt became my mentor when I studied social psychology and implemented action research as a neophyte at the University of Michigan from 1959 to 1962. I was a doctoral student in those years, and then as a postdoctoral researcher from 1963 to 1966. In remembering her husband in the preface to the 1948 Applied Collection, Gertrude Lewin wrote, "Kurt was so constantly and predominantly preoccupied with the task of advancing the conceptual representation of the social psychological world, and at the same time he was so filled with the urgent desire to make use of his theoretical insights for the building of a better world, that it is difficult for me to decide which of those two sources of motivation flowed with greater energy or vigor." I was very fortunate to be in Ann Arbor in the early 60s. It's like being in Paris during the 1920s. I was thoroughly educated by Lewinians, traveling both paths. We had over 250 psychologists, social psychologists, etc., in a fairly small Midwest town. I chose to focus most of my professional career on the second path. I always kept in mind, however, Lewin's famous maxim that there's nothing so practical as a good theory, and I've sought primarily to create social interventions to upgrade educational procedures in public K-12 schools as well as institutions of higher learning. I have built upon Lewin's action research to improve classroom group dynamics, school organizational functioning of staffs, and instructional leadership of administrators. The heart of my social research has centered on the development of effective group problem-solving procedures for students, parents, teachers, and administrators to engage in cooperatively. When the 72-year-old Ron Lippitt died in 1986, I wrote a paragraph for family members to read at the celebration of his life as follows. Ron's influence on me was enormous. While collaborating with him, I became a practical and optimistic action researcher with a moral conscience. I learned to prefer lighting a candle to complaining about the darkness. Indeed, our souls and minds danced side by side as cross-age peers in pursuit of cooperative democracy in schools. With Ron's left hand on Kurt's shoulder and his right hand on mine, the three of us form a half-century, 1936 to 1986, of electricity to light up group cooperation and organizational self-renewal. Adhering to Lewin's admonition, no action without research, no research without action, Second Path Lewinians designed interventions to alter concrete group structures, leadership patterns, and cultural norms with the aim of collaborating to solve actual social problems. They understood planned change in education to require an integration of research, training, and action. They taught that the facilitation of real change would depend on data-based diagnosis, social skill training, and action plans with measurable outcomes in specific, concrete educational situations. In the final chapter of Lewin's final publication in 1948, he wrote about the two overlapping intellectual paths that would become ISE's main body of work. Lewin wrote, "Social research concerns itself with two different questions, namely the study of general laws in group life and the diagnosis of followed by action on specific situations." To explain this further, he wrote, "Problems of general laws deal with the relations between conditions and results. They are expressed in if-so, or you might say if-then propositions. The knowledge of laws can serve as guidance for the achievement of certain objectives under certain conditions. But to act correctly, they do not suffice. If engineers or surgeons know the general laws of physics or physiology, they still can't necessarily take the right, correct action. They have to know the specific character of the situation at hand. This character is determined by the scientific fact-finding we'll call diagnosis. For any field of action, both types of scientific study will be needed." We of ISE walk on both paths together. Sometimes on the first, other times on the second. Sometimes crossing over from one path to the other. On the first path, that of Morton Deutsch and David Johnson, we are concerned with explaining how cooperation in education works. Look, here comes Isabella Pescarmona. Where is she? Here she is. Here she comes. Here she comes. Winner of the Elizabeth Cohen Award. She's walking down path 1 this time. Maybe path 2 next time. On path 2, that of Ron Lippin and myself, we wish to intervene to enhance effectiveness of cooperation in education. Look, here comes Celeste Brew, our president. On path 1, we seek to build theory and to accumulate knowledge about cooperation in education. Look, here comes Robin Gillies, recipient of our research award. On path 2, we are concerned with fostering change so that cooperation is more effective in education. Look, here comes Spencer Kagan. Here comes Yael Sharon. On path 1, we seek to obtain valid data about cooperation in education. Look, here comes Neil Davidson. He's not here. Here comes Robert Slavin. On path 2, we try to collect trustworthy diagnoses from specific educators who are fostering educational cooperation. Look, here comes Elizabeth Cohen. On path 1, we strive to establish generalized principles about cooperation in education. Look, here comes Shlomo Shimon and his Israeli colleagues. On path 2, we want to increase local effectiveness of cooperation in education. Look, here comes Alan Watkins, winner of our Service and Activism Award, along with Julie Boyd. Is Julie Boyd here? No? George Jacobs and others. Look at all of us as we travel along paths together. Look at how we are walking down both paths at this convention. Review our history to see how members of our association in previous years have traveled together. Consider how the Lewinian legacy in my lifetime has influenced what we are becoming. After all, we're still pretty young, 31. We have many years yet to contribute to a more cooperative educational world. Thank you.
Don't go just yet, please. I've asked Yael Sharon is going to give Dick the award for Lifetime Achievement. So honor him together. Thank you.
I'll try and speak loudly so you can hear me. Dig, to prepare for this important occasion, I took down my copy of the 4th edition of the Group Processes in the Classroom from 1983. And it's full of underlined sentences and paragraphs. Rereading it, it was clear that the ideas and practical suggestions you and Pat wrote about are still fresh, still applicable, and still require patience and persistence for successful implementation, as your son Alan pointed out in the introduction. Look up the 1983 edition for a good joke about jackass.
Yeah.
Okay, you can ask him for the joke.
Patience, Jack.
Patience,
Patience,
right.
yeah.
Well, there are lots of firsts in your relationship with the IASCE. You were with us from the beginning, as you mentioned, as you know. In 1979, at the first conference, when you gave the keynote that set the tone for the association's broad understanding of cooperative learning, you were elected the first president, then called chairman. I noticed
Chairman,
in
yes.
the old
Right.
newsletters.
Yes,
right.
it was chairman.
A personal note, you were also the first reader of my book and gave many helpful comments. And today you are the first to receive the IASCE Lifetime Achievement Award, which recognizes your lifelong dedication to helping school organizations become fully engaging places for learning and your unwavering commitment to cooperation in education. Although you are first, you are not alone. And true to your belief in cooperation, you have always collaborated with others in your research and writing. Pat is here to attest in person to that lifelong synergy. You collaborated with and acknowledge an impressive list of giants on whose shoulders you stand, as well as those with whom you worked, and without a doubt, those who stand on your shoulders, now and in the future. I take this opportunity to publicly apologize for not having met you at the airport at Tel Aviv in 1979. I was there, but I didn't know what he looked like, and I just didn't find him.
Didn't have Facebook.
Yeah, right.
I got there somehow. I don't
Yeah.
remember. Taxi, I think.
But we've met many times since through the good offices of the organization. It is my privilege to present you with the IASCE Lifetime Achievement Award. Since your lifetime is still valid, we look forward to your future contributions to the field of cooperation in education, as they do in Japan.
questions or comments? We could do it over tea. Remember I said you still have to meet him yet. All right, is everyone ready? Joy?
Dick, I wonder if you could just give one example of an action research that Kurt Lewin did.
The most famous one was the intergroup relations study that was done in Connecticut that Ron Lippitt wrote a book called Training in Community Relations. It took place in the late 40s. They were trying to reduce mainly anti-Semitism in the community. Seems to me the community was New Haven, but one near New Haven. And they had worked with the social leaders and school administrators and so forth with a data collection on the community from citizens. They fed the data back to them, and they ran some workshops on human relationships, which actually led to the development of the National Training Laboratories, which started a year later and met every summer in Bethel, Maine for many, many years. And that was what we called in those days sensitivity training. So that was kind of the major study. But he didn't do many, unfortunately.
Don't go yet. Thank you. We have Robin.
Thank you very much, Celeste. On behalf of the ISC, I'd like to present you with a small token of our appreciation, a little bit of Australiana for you to take back with you.
Okay.
It was wonderful, that presentation, that review of the history of the association. Many of the names that you referred to are ones that a number of us are very familiar with, but it's very nice to be able to have them contextualised and to have your review of the history of cooperation in education. We hope that we can look forward to many, many more years of it continuing. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
All right, I guess we're on to tea. That's a good thing.
We're on time.
We're on to
Okay,
We're on time.
Thank you, Spencer, for this apparatus.
So keep the conversation going over tea.